Hello and welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can move and set an object's pivot point in Unreal. In a previous video, I showed you how to export an entire scene from something like Maya or Max and import that scene into Unreal. And I mentioned about how you need to be very mindful of the pivot points of your objects in Maya, because if you reset the transformations or freeze transformations, you won't have the pivot centered on your objects when you import them. Now, in response to that video, someone asked a question about um, how do I move an object's pivot point in Unreal. So I thought, well, this would be a good topic for a video, and here we are. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep it very simple and basic. I'm going to use one of the cone assets that I used in that previous video, and this has come from Megascans, and this has got this object's pivot perfectly positioned for what we want. You know, it's at the center of the object and it's at the base as well. So it's ideal for moving around in your scene. Now, how do we move the pivot to wherever we want it to for any particular reason? Well, that's actually really quite simple. You hold down the Alt key on your keyboard and choose an axis, and then you hold down the middle mouse button and then drag. And you'll notice the pivot has now moved away from the object and it's now set to wherever I want it to. That's fine. The key to remember here is this is really a temporary move, because if I was to deselect this object or select another object and then reselect it, the pivot has now snapped back to its original position. So when you do an Alt middle mouse click drag, as long as you keep the object selected, you can transform it. But then as soon as you deselect it, it will reset. So how do we then move the pivot and then make that move more permanent? Well, again, it's again quite simple. Let's move the pivot to somewhere where we want it to be, like there. Now we right mouse click the asset, scroll down to the bottom of the menu where it's got pivot, and just choose set pivot offset. And that has now made that move more permanent. So if I was to deselect or select another object, reselect the object, the pivot is exactly where I want it to be, and I can move it accordingly. Now, what's really cool about this is, say, for an example, you then decide, well, I want now the pivot to go back to its original position. Well, that's even simpler, because, again, right-click the asset, either in the viewport or the world outliner. It doesn't really matter. Scroll back down to your pivot menu, and this time choose Reset Pivot Offset, and you'll now see that it's now snapped back to its original position when the asset was imported. So this is really cool. In some ways, this is like a non-destructive way of moving an object's pivot to where you want it to. Do a transform for whatever reason, and then you can reset it back. There's also a couple of other options here that you can also use to move the pivot and set it to wherever you want. They are based upon where you your point of selection. So let's just zoom in a bit now to this mesh, and let's say we click here, for example, in the middle or somewhere in this top reflector section. So if I was to now right click here, scroll to the pivot menu, and this time choose this option, set pivot offset here, you'll notice the pivot has now moved to exactly to the point where I did the right mouse click. And this will work obviously in the viewport. But of course, when you do this, it's not always necessarily going to put it wherever you want it to. You're going to have to accept that there'll be some maybe slight offset. Again, if I do it down here and then choose that option, the pivot will move. Now there's another option here just below that to set pivot offset here, but snapped. And it says that basically this will move it to the nearest grid point to the click location. Now, when you do this one, if I was to choose that, you can often get some weird settings here because you have to think more three-dimensionally. So if I was to now just reset my object's pivot point again, I'm going to get rid of the floor and then just get everything down to the base of the grid. Now, a good way to use this is go to your top view, and now you could want to say, well, what I want to do is put the pivot here somewhere along my grid. Now, of course, you can move and snap it to the grid. That's not a problem. But again, if you were to just click roughly here and now pivot snapped, it will move to the nearest grid point of the selection. If I just move my selection a bit further up to say roughly about there and do the same, it will move it to this grid point. Again, if I just move over here and do the same, it'll move it there. So you get the whole idea. This will also work in the other views as well. And again, it's important to think about that when you're actually using this particular feature. So again, if I was to say, click it right down here and then snapped, you'll notice it's moved it there. And then if we go back to perspective, you can see that it's aligned correctly. And of course, at any time, you can right mouse click, go to pivot, and then reset the offset, and you're back to the original position. So those are the basic options you've got around being able to move and set the object's pivot point. There is also the option to center on the selection as well, but either way, no matter what option you choose, you can always reset it to the original position of the object when you first imported it. So again, it's a really good way of working. It's simple and non-destructive. Now, if you were bringing in assets from a package like Maya, Max, Blender, Modo, whatever your choice is, personally speaking, I would always try and make sure that you've got your objects pivots set in that package before you do the export, because I think it's always good to have consistency between the two worlds you're working in, Unreal and also the 3D software world. You've got to have some consistency. But however, if you're not bothered about that and you just want to plow on into Unreal, then there's nothing wrong with that. And again, you can move the object's pivot point to wherever you want and then just reset it, or even just maintain the offset. I mean, you don't have to reset it. You can just keep it where it is and then just continue working. So anyway, that's it for today. A nice short video. Hope that was really useful, and I'll see you again next time.